I wore my courthouse security uniform to my sister's engagement dinner because I came straight from work. Her fiancé took one look at me and burst out laughing. Security guard? Really? That's embarrassing for the family. He smirked while cutting his steak. Good thing someone in this family will actually make money. I smiled and said, "You're absolutely right about making money." That's when my sister pulled out the wedding invitation, showing the venue. Riverside County Superior Court. The same courthouse where I work. Not as a security guard, as Judge Lydia Ravenwood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lydia Catherine Ravenwood. I'm 34 years old, and I've been sitting on the bench for 2 years. But if you think this story is just about a case of mistaken identity, stay tuned, because when arrogance meets justice, the gavel always falls on the right side, and sometimes the person holding it is someone you should have treated with respect from the very beginning. It started 3 months ago at Rosehaven Country Club in Millbrook Heights. My younger sister, Delilah, was celebrating her engagement to Brandon Castellanos, a personal injury attorney who drove a leased BMW and talked about his wins louder than anyone asked to hear them. I'd come straight from court, still wearing my black security-style blazer because the judicial robes stay in chambers, obviously. Most people wouldn't know the difference between courthouse security and a district court judge just by looking at the uniform. The blazer looks official, authoritative, but not obviously judicial to the untrained eye. Brandon didn't bother with introductions. He just saw the badge, the radio clipped to my belt, the professional but service-oriented uniform, and made his assumptions. Loud assumptions in front of the entire engagement party. "So, you are the family security guard," he announced to the table of 12, wine making his voice carry further than necessary. "That's interesting. I mean, it's honest work, I suppose." He gestured with his fork like he was conducting an orchestra of condescension. "Though I have to say, Delilah, it's a little awkward having a rent-a-cop sister when you're marrying into legal circles." The table went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet where people are impressed, the uncomfortable kind where everyone suddenly finds their salmon very fascinating. My sister's face turned pink, but she didn't defend me. She just looked down at her engagement ring like it might transport her somewhere else. I should have corrected him right then. Should have explained that my security uniform was actually the professional attire of a Superior Court judge who'd graduated summa cum laude from Westfield Law School, passed the bar on her first attempt, and been appointed to the bench after 8 years as a prosecutor. Should have mentioned that my honest work involved presiding over felony cases, determining sentences, and making legal decisions that affected thousands of lives. But something about his smug expression stopped me. The way he leaned back in his chair like he owned the room, the way he kept glancing around to make sure everyone heard his little performance, the way my sister's friends were trying not to smile while my own sister said nothing. So instead, I just nodded. "You're absolutely right, Brandon. Someone in this family should definitely make good money." I took a sip of my water, watching him preen at what he thought was my admission of inferiority. Financial security is so important in a marriage. He laughed, the kind of laugh that's meant to exclude rather than include. "Exactly. I mean, no offense, but when Delilah and I have kids, we'll need to think about private schools, country club memberships, the right neighborhood. A security guard salary just—" He made a helpless gesture with his hands. "Just wouldn't cut it." I completely understand. The conversation moved on, but Brandon wasn't done with his entertainment. Throughout dinner, he made little comments. When the check came, he made a show of paying, saying, "Don't worry about it, Lydia. I know things are probably tight on your salary." When someone mentioned vacation plans, he chuckled and said, "Well, some of us will be going to the Hamptons, others will be working security at the mall." Each comment landed like a small slap, designed to remind everyone present of what he saw as my place in the social hierarchy. My sister laughed along nervously, never once correcting me or defending me. Never once mentioning that I had helped pay for her law school tuition or that I had been the one to get her the internship at the DA's office that launched her career as a victim advocate. The final insult came when he stood up to leave. He actually patted me like I was a child. Good to work. Good, keep up the good work, Officer Ravenwood. The world needs people willing to do the jobs the rest of us can't. That's when my sister pulled out the wedding invitation, showing the venue. Riverside County Superior Court. The same courthouse where I work. Not as a security guard, as Judge Lydia Ravenwood. Because little did Brandon know, he'd just spent the evening insulting the woman who would soon be sitting 10 feet above him, wearing black robes instead of a security blazer, holding the power to make his professional life very, very interesting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you how I ended up in that courthouse blazer in the first place, and why my sister's engagement dinner became the scene of my greatest professional humiliation. Because the truth is, I never wanted anyone to know I was a judge, not out of shame, but out of protection. For my family, for my cases, and for the careful balance I'd spent years building between Lydia, the sister, and Judge Ravenwood, the legal authority. Growing up in Millbrook Heights, Delilah and I were raised by our grandmother, Rosalie Thorne, after our parents died in a car accident when I was 16 and she was 12. Grandma Rosalie worked 3 jobs to keep us in our family home on Elmwood Avenue. Morning shift at the diner, afternoon cleaning offices, and weekend catering gigs for the wealthy families on Beacon Hill. She never complained, never made us feel like burdens, but I saw the exhaustion in her eyes every night when she counted bills at the kitchen table. I made a promise to myself at 16. I would become successful enough to take care of both of them. Not just successful, powerful enough that no one could ever make my family feel small again. Law school wasn't a career choice for me, it was a mission. While other kids were at parties, I was studying for the LSAT. While they were spring breaking in Cancun, I was working double shifts at Millbrook General Hospital to save money for applications. I graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High, earned a full scholarship to Westfield University, then another to Westfield Law School. Every honor, every achievement, every late night in the library was for the promise I'd made in our tiny kitchen. Delilah took a different path. She was the social one, the charming one, the one who could walk into any room and make friends instantly. While I buried myself in case law, she studied communications and event planning. When she struggled with her own law school applications, I helped her with essays, paid for prep courses, and used my connections to get her that DA internship. When she couldn't afford her apartment in Center City, I quietly covered half her rent for 2 years. When she wanted to attend networking events but couldn't afford the wardrobe, I took her shopping and called it birthday gifts. I never told her I was appointed to the bench. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I knew she'd feel obligated to brag, and I couldn't risk that. Judges in Riverside County handle sensitive cases: domestic violence, organized crime, high-profile civil suits. The last thing I needed was my personal life bleeding into my professional reputation, or my family becoming targets because of the cases I presided over. So I kept it simple. When people asked what I did, I said I worked at the courthouse. When they pressed for details, I'd mention security clearance and sensitive documents, which was technically true. Judges do handle classified information, and we do have security protocols. I just let people draw their own conclusions about my role. The blazer was part of this careful deception. Real courthouse security wears different uniforms, but the general public doesn't know that. The black blazer, radio, and badge were generic enough to support the illusion, while being professional enough for my actual position. Most days I'd drive to work in the blazer, then change into robes in my chambers. After court, I'd switch back to the blazer for the drive home. It was a simple system that protected my privacy and my family's safety. Delilah never questioned it. Why would she? She was busy building her own career as a victim advocate, dating various men she'd meet through her work, living the social life I had never had time for. We'd meet for lunch, maybe once a month, and she'd tell me about her cases, her dates, her dreams of finding someone successful enough to give her the life she had always wanted. When she called me 3 months ago, breathless with excitement about Brandon Castellanos, I was genuinely happy for her. She'd been dating him for 6 months, and from what she'd told me, he was everything she thought she wanted. Successful attorney, nice car, expensive tastes, talked about marriage and children and country club memberships. He painted him as ambitious, driven, someone who could provide the security we'd never had growing up. "He's taking me to meet his partners next week," she'd gushed over the phone. "And Lydia, he wants to have an engagement party at Rosehaven. Can you believe it? We're actually going to be members somewhere Grandma Rosalie used to cater." I should have been thrilled for her. The little girl who used to watch those fancy parties through the kitchen door was now going to be the guest of honor. But something in her voice gave me a pause, a desperate edge, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "Does he make you happy?" "He makes me feel important," which wasn't quite the same thing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 18 years building exactly the kind of success and security she was looking for in a man. I had the financial stability, the professional respect, the power to protect our family from ever feeling small again. But because I'd hidden it so carefully, she was seeking those things from someone else entirely. Someone who, as it turned out, thought people like me, people who worked service jobs, people who wore uniforms, people who didn't drive luxury cars or belonged to country clubs, were beneath him. If only I'd known that keeping my secret would put me in the perfect position to discover exactly who Brandon Castellanos really was. The week after the engagement dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Not just Brandon's behavior toward me, though that stung more than I cared to admit, but something deeper about the entire situation. So I did what any good judge does when the facts don't add up. I investigated. It started innocently enough. Delilah had mentioned that Brandon was handling a huge case that would set them up financially for life. As someone who'd spent years in the legal system, I was curious about what kind of personal injury case could generate that level of confidence. So I did a simple search in the state court database under his name. What I found was underwhelming. Brandon Castellanos had been practicing law for 4 years, exclusively handling slip-and-fall cases, minor fender benders, and workers' compensation claims. His biggest settlement to date was $47,000 for a grocery store accident. His average case value was under $15,000. This wasn't the profile of an attorney who could afford country club memberships and Hampton vacations. Curious, I dug deeper. Bar Association records showed he'd graduated from Millbrook Community College, then attended Tri-State Law School, not exactly a prestigious institution. He'd failed the bar exam twice before passing on his third attempt. His law firm, Castellanos and Associates, was registered to a strip mall address on Route 9, and the associates were just him and a part-time paralegal named Jenny Chen. None of this made sense with the lifestyle he was flaunting. The BMW, the expensive dinners, the talk of private schools and vacation homes. Where was the money coming from? That's when I remembered something from the engagement party. Brandon had been very specific about knowing judges, about having connections in the legal community. He'd mentioned presiding over their wedding ceremony and name-dropped several attorneys who supposedly respected his work. As someone who actually worked in these circles, I knew I should have recognized at least some of these names. I didn't recognize any of them. So I called my colleague, Judge Patricia Whitmore, who'd been on the Riverside County bench for 15 years. Patricia knew every attorney worth knowing in our jurisdiction. "Brandon Castellanos?" she repeated when I asked. "Never heard of him. And honey, I've seen every personal injury attorney in this county at least once. If he's never appeared before me or any of my colleagues, he's either brand new or he's not handling the kind of cases he claims to be handling." That conversation led me down a rabbit hole that consumed my entire weekend. I pulled his business registration documents, his bar association dues records, even his professional liability insurance filings. What I discovered was a pattern of exaggeration that bordered on outright fraud. His law firm's registered address was indeed a strip mall, sandwiched between a nail salon and a tax preparation service.
The office space was listed as 200 square feet, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. His malpractice insurance was the minimum required by the state bar, covering only $100,000 in claims. For context, attorneys handling significant personal injury cases typically carry $1 million or more in coverage. But the most revealing discovery came when I cross-referenced his client list with court filings. In 4 years of practice, Brandon had filed exactly 17 cases that went to court. 17! Most personal injury attorneys file that many cases in a month. The rest of his practice appeared to consist of writing demand letters to insurance companies for minor accidents, most of which settled for nuisance amounts under $5,000. This wasn't the successful legal career he'd been describing to my sister and her friends. So where was the money coming from? That question led me to public record searches that revealed the uncomfortable truth. Brandon's lifestyle wasn't funded by his legal success. It was funded by debt, extensive debt. His BMW was leased, not owned, and according to credit reports I could access through my court system privileges, he was already 2 payments behind. His apartment in the trendy Riverfront district was also beyond his means. He'd been late on rent 4 times in the past year. Credit card debt totaled over $67,000 across 8 different cards, most of them maxed out. But here's what made my blood run cold. 3 weeks before the engagement party, Brandon had submitted a financial statement to Prestige Bank for a mortgage pre-approval. The application was for a $450,000 home loan for a house in the exclusive Oakmont Hills subdivision, the same neighborhood where he told Delilah they'd be living after the wedding. On that application, he'd listed his annual income as $185,000, but his actual tax returns, which I could verify through court databases, showed an annual income of $31,000 last year. He'd inflated his earnings by nearly 600%. More disturbing was the section about his fiancé's financial contribution. The application listed Delilah's expected inheritance as $275,000, with a note that she was the beneficiary of a family trust that would mature upon marriage. This was completely fabricated. Our grandmother had left us the Elmwood Avenue house and exactly $8,400 in savings, which we'd used for her funeral expenses. Brandon was planning to commit mortgage fraud using my sister as an unwitting accomplice based on money that simply didn't exist.
But the most chilling discovery came last. I found a credit application from 2 months ago where Brandon had applied for a joint credit card account. The application listed both his name and Delilah's name, along with her social security number and employment information. According to the timestamps, this application had been submitted while Delilah was at work, meaning he'd filled it out without her knowledge. The application had been approved for a $25,000 limit. When I checked the account activity, my worst fears were confirmed. The card had been used extensively over the past 6 weeks. Expensive dinners, shopping sprees, even the down payment for the engagement party at Rosehaven Country Club. Brandon had been funding his lifestyle and their entire relationship using credit cards opened in my sister's name. Delilah had no idea she was already legally responsible for thousands of dollars in debt that she'd never authorized. Debt that was accumulating interest while Brandon planned a wedding funded by mortgage fraud and false financial statements. The man who'd laughed at my security guard uniform and mocked my supposedly low income was actually a failing attorney living on stolen credit while defrauding banks and identity theft victims. The man my sister thought would provide her with financial security was systematically destroying her financial future before they were even married. And he had no idea that the rent-a-cop he'd humiliated was about to discover it all. Sitting in my home office that Sunday night, surrounded by printouts of Brandon's financial crimes, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time since that humiliating dinner, I wasn't thinking like Lydia, the embarrassed sister. I was thinking like Judge Ravenwood. And Judge Ravenwood had just uncovered a multifaceted criminal enterprise that happened to be targeting her family.
The irony was almost poetic. Brandon had spent an entire evening mocking what he assumed was my powerless position, completely unaware that he was confessing his crimes to someone with the authority to destroy him. Not just the authority, the obligation. Because what I discovered wasn't just personal betrayal anymore, it was a federal case waiting to happen. Identity theft across state lines becomes a federal crime when it involves financial institutions. Mortgage fraud triggers federal banking regulations. Wire fraud, which includes electronic credit applications with false information, falls under federal jurisdiction. Brandon hadn't just embarrassed me at a dinner party, he'd committed at least 6 federal felonies in my presence, thinking I was too insignificant to matter. But here's what he couldn't have known. Judges don't just preside over cases. We're mandatory reporters for certain crimes, especially those involving financial institutions. When a sitting judge becomes aware of ongoing federal crimes, we have legal obligations that supersede family loyalty or personal feelings. The moment I verified Brandon's criminal activity through official channels, I wasn't just Lydia anymore. I was an officer of the court who'd witnessed federal crimes in progress. The question wasn't whether I would act. The question was how strategically I would time my response. I opened my secure laptop and logged into the federal case management system, access that comes with my judicial credentials. What I was about to do would create an official paper trail that couldn't be undone, but Brandon made that inevitable the moment he decided to commit federal crimes while dating a federal judge's sister. First, I filed a suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This wasn't revenge. It was my legal duty as a judge who'd uncovered evidence of bank fraud. The report detailed the mortgage application discrepancies, the unauthorized credit accounts, and the pattern of false statements to financial institutions. Once filed, this report would trigger automatic investigations by multiple federal agencies. Next, I accessed the integrated case management system and cross-referenced Brandon's name with pending cases in all federal districts. What I found confirmed my suspicions. He was already on the radar. The FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force had opened a preliminary investigation 3 months ago based on suspicious credit applications filed from his office address. They just hadn't connected him to the Lydia Ravenwood identity theft yet. That was about to change. Using my judicial access credentials, I uploaded the evidence I had gathered to the existing case file, along with a detailed memo explaining my relationship to one of the victims and my discovery process. In the federal system, when a sitting judge submits evidence of ongoing crimes, it gets immediate priority review. My submission would land on a federal prosecutor's desk by Monday morning. But I wasn't done. Brandon's crimes weren't just federal, they fell under state jurisdiction too. As a Superior Court judge in Riverside County, I had direct relationships with every prosecutor in the districts. More importantly, I had something Brandon couldn't have possibly anticipated. I knew exactly which prosecutors specialized in financial crimes and which ones had personal experience with identity theft cases. Sarah Chen, no relation to Brandon's paralegal, was the deputy DA who'd built her career prosecuting complex financial fraud. She was also someone who'd worked closely with my court on several high-profile cases and trusted my judgment implicitly. More relevantly, Sarah's own sister had been a victim of identity theft 2 years ago, making this type of case deeply personal for her. I crafted a careful email to Sarah, marking it with the judicial priority flag that ensures immediate attention. In it, I explained that I discovered evidence of ongoing financial crimes that appeared to involve my sister as an unwitting victim. I attached the documentation I had gathered and requested that her office coordinate with the federal investigation that would be launching Monday morning.
The beauty of this approach was its complete legitimacy. I wasn't acting as an angry sister seeking revenge. I was acting as a Superior Court judge fulfilling my legal obligations to report federal crimes. The fact that it would personally benefit me was secondary to my professional duty. At least, that's how it would appear in any official review. By midnight Sunday, I'd set in motion investigations at 3 levels: federal, state, and financial institutional. Brandon's crimes would be investigated by the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force, prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for federal charges, and simultaneously pursued by the Riverside County District Attorney for state identity theft charges. The banks involved would also launch their own investigations, potentially triggering civil restitution procedures. But the most satisfying part of my strategic response was something Brandon couldn't possibly see coming: his choice of wedding venue. When Delilah had showed me those photos of Riverside County Superior Court, I'd realized that Brandon had unknowingly chosen to hold his wedding at my courthouse. Not just any courthouse, mine. The building where I'd presided over hundreds of cases, where every security guard knew me by name, where my nameplate sat outside courtroom 7. Brandon thought he was choosing an elegant venue for his fraudulent wedding. What he'd actually done was select the perfect location for his arrest. Because here's what happens when federal financial crimes investigations conclude. Arrests typically occur in the most symbolically appropriate location possible. For someone who'd committed identity theft and bank fraud while planning a wedding, that location would almost certainly be the courthouse where the wedding was scheduled to take place. The federal timeline for financial crimes prosecution typically runs 90 to 120 days from initial filing to arrest warrant. Brandon and Delilah's wedding was scheduled for exactly 14 weeks from today. The timing wasn't just coincidental, it was perfect. I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of wine, finally understanding why I'd felt so calm during Brandon's performance at the engagement party. Some part of me had recognized that his arrogance would be his downfall. He'd been so confident in his superiority, so certain that people like me were beneath his notice, that he'd never considered the possibility that the security guard he was mocking might actually have the power to end him. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would begin building a case that would dismantle his entire fraudulent life. Prosecutors would start assembling charges that could result in decades in federal prison. Bank investigators would freeze accounts and trace every fraudulent transaction. And Brandon would have no idea it was happening until the moment federal marshals walked into his wedding venue to arrest him. The man who'd laughed at my uniform had just discovered that sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person with the power to destroy you. He just didn't know it yet. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a legal proceeding. By 8:47 a.m., my phone was ringing with a call from Deputy DA Sarah Chen. Her voice carried the controlled excitement of a prosecutor who'd been handed a career-defining case. "Judge Ravenwood, I've reviewed your submission from last night. This is extraordinary work. We're looking at a multi-jurisdictional case with clear federal implications. I need to ask you some questions about your investigative process and your relationship to the victim." We met at Cafe Meridian, a quiet spot near the courthouse where prosecutors and judges often discussed sensitive matters away from official channels. Sarah arrived with a thick file folder and the kind of intense focus that made her one of the most effective financial crimes prosecutors in the state. "First, I need to understand your position in this case. You're sitting Superior Court judge who discovered evidence of federal crimes being committed against your sister. That puts you in a unique position. You're both a mandatory reporter and a victim's family member. How do you want to handle the ethical considerations?" I'd spent the early morning hours preparing for exactly this question. I want to recuse myself from any direct prosecution involvement, but I can serve as a witness and provide expert testimony about the evidence I discovered through legal channels. My judicial access was used legitimately to verify public records and coordinate with appropriate agencies. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. Now, let me tell you what happened after you filed your reports last night. The FBI Financial Crimes Task Force escalated this immediately because of your judicial standing. Special Agent Robert Kane called me at 6 a.m. They want to coordinate a joint federal-state prosecution. She opened her file to reveal a timeline that took my breath away. "Judge Ravenwood, your sister isn't Brandon's only victim. When the FBI cross-referenced the evidence you provided with their existing investigation, they discovered a pattern. Brandon has been running identity theft schemes against at least 6 other women over the past 2 years.
The FBI believes your sister is actually his most ambitious target," Sarah continued. "The mortgage fraud attempt and the scale of the identity theft suggest he was planning to use her as the foundation for a major financial scheme. If their wedding had proceeded, he would have gained legal access to her finances as a spouse, making the fraud much harder to detect and prosecute." Agent Kane joined us 20 minutes later, a serious man in his 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. His first words confirmed what I'd suspected. "Judge Ravenwood, Mr. Castellanos chose the wrong family to victimize.
Your background and investigative work have given us everything we need to build an airtight case. Kane spread out surveillance photos that made my stomach turn. Images of Brandon entering apartment buildings where his other victims lived, Brandon meeting with individuals the FBI suspected were helping him launder money, Brandon at luxury car dealerships using fraudulent financial statements to negotiate leases he couldn't afford. We've been watching him for 3 months, but we needed evidence of active crimes in progress, Kane explained. Your documentation provided that evidence. More importantly, your judicial status means every piece of evidence you gathered is automatically admissible in federal court. No warrant challenges, no procedural questions. You had legal authority to access everything you found. The strategic advantages were extraordinary. As a sitting judge, my investigation carried legal weight that civilian victims couldn't provide. My familiarity with federal crime reporting procedures meant the evidence was documented properly from the beginning. Most importantly, my relationships within the judicial system meant the case would receive priority treatment at every level. Sarah outlined the prosecution strategy. We're filing federal charges first: wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Those carry potential sentences of 15 to 20 years. Then we'll follow with state charges for each individual identity theft case. The federal charges will be processed through the Southern District, where Judge Patricia Whitmore has agreed to hear the case. Patricia's involvement was particularly satisfying. She's the judge I'd consulted about Brandon's reputation, and she'd volunteered to handle the federal proceedings when she learned about the case. Patricia had a reputation for harsh sentences in financial crimes cases, especially those involving identity theft against women. But Agent Kane had more strategic advantages to reveal. Judge Ravenwood, we want to propose something unusual. Given your sister's status as an unwitting victim and your position as a judicial witness, we'd like to coordinate the arrest timing with maximum impact. Mr. Castellanos has shown a pattern of targeting women he perceives as powerless. We want to make sure he understands exactly how wrong he was about your family. The plan they outlined was audacious. Rather than arresting Brandon at his office or home, they wanted to wait until the wedding day. Federal marshals would be stationed throughout Riverside County Superior Court, ostensibly for routine security. When Brandon arrived for his ceremony, he'd be arrested on the courthouse steps in full view of all the wedding guests. The symbolism matters in these cases, Kane explained. Brandon chose your courthouse because he thought it would impress people with his legal connections. Instead, it will become the location where he learns that real legal power looks very different from what he imagined. Sarah added the final strategic element. We'll be arresting his accomplices simultaneously: the paralegal who helped process fraudulent documents, the loan broker who falsified applications, and the credit consultant who helped him manipulate credit reports. By the time your sister's wedding ceremony was supposed to begin, Brandon's entire criminal network will be in federal custody. The coordination required was complex but feasible. The wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Saturday, exactly 12 weeks away. Federal arrest warrants will be finalized by Friday. Agent Kane's team would be positioned throughout the courthouse by Saturday morning, ready to execute the arrests the moment Brandon and his accomplices arrived. "What about my sister?" I asked. "She's completely innocent in this, but she'll be devastated. The public humiliation, the financial damage he's already caused her." Sarah's expression softened. "Judge Ravenwood, we've seen cases like this before. Your sister is going to be grateful that you stopped this before the wedding. Brandon was escalating his crimes. If he'd become her legal spouse, the financial damage would have been catastrophic. You didn't just save her from embarrassment. You saved her from potential bankruptcy and decades of financial recovery." Agent Kane nodded. "And Judge, there's something else. Federal victims of identity theft are eligible for restitution and financial restoration services. Your sister will be made completely whole financially, and Brandon's assets will be seized to compensate all his victims. She'll actually end up in better financial shape than she was before she met him." As we finalized the coordination plan, I felt a profound sense of professional satisfaction. This wasn't revenge, it was justice being served with surgical precision. Brandon had mistaken kindness for weakness, family loyalty for stupidity, and a service uniform for powerlessness. In exactly 12 weeks, he would learn the difference between real authority and the fake importance he'd been projecting. The man who'd mocked my security guard uniform would be arrested by federal marshals in the same courthouse where I presided over justice every day. The irony was so perfect, it felt like legal poetry. 3 weeks into the federal investigation, Delilah called me at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, her voice shaking with confusion and fear.
Lydia, something strange is happening with my credit cards. I got a call from Riverside Bank saying I'm behind on payments for an account I never opened. And Brandon is acting different. He keeps asking me about our family finances, about Grandma Rosalie's estate, about whether you have any savings. When I tell him I don't know, he gets angry. My heart sank. The investigation was progressing perfectly, but Brandon was starting to panic. According to Agent Kane's latest briefing, the FBI had frozen several of his fraudulent accounts, ostensibly as part of routine banking audits. Brandon wouldn't know the freezes were connected to a federal investigation, but he definitely noticed that his funding sources were disappearing. Delilah, I need you to listen to me carefully, I said. Don't give Brandon any more financial information about our family. Don't sign any documents he brings you. And whatever you do, don't let him pressure you into any major financial decisions before the wedding. Why? Lydia, you're scaring me. What's going on? I wanted desperately to tell her everything, but Agent Kane had been clear. The investigation's success depended on Brandon not knowing he was being watched. If Delilah's behavior changed dramatically, Brandon might suspect something and flee. We were too close to justice to risk it now. I can't explain everything right now, but please trust me. Just be careful with financial decisions until after the wedding, okay? The next morning, Brandon called me directly for the first time since the engagement party. His voice carried a forced cheerfulness that didn't mask the underlying desperation. Hey, Lydia. Hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to chat with you about something. Delilah mentioned you work in courthouse security, and I'm wondering if you might know about government jobs that pay better. I have this friend who's looking for opportunities, and you know how it is. Sometimes it's about who you know, right? I recognized this conversation for what it was. Fishing expedition. Brandon was trying to figure out if I had access to information or resources he could exploit. The man who'd mocked my uniform 3 weeks ago was now trying to use my supposed connections for his benefit. What kind of opportunities is your friend looking for? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Well, you know, anything in the judicial system, court clerk positions, administrative jobs, maybe even bailiff work. He's very interested in the financial side of things, payroll, benefits administration, that sort of thing. Payroll and benefits administration. Brandon wasn't asking about jobs for a friend. He was trying to figure out if I had access to government financial systems he could somehow exploit. The audacity was breathtaking. I'll keep an ear out, I said simply. Though most positions require extensive background checks and security clearances. Oh, that wouldn't be a problem for my friend. He's very, clean. No issues with credit or anything like that. After I hung up, I immediately called Agent Kane to report the conversation. His response was immediate and alarmed. Judge Ravenwood, Brandon is starting to panic. When financial fraudsters begin reaching out to family members about government access, it usually means they're planning an exit strategy. We need to accelerate our timeline. But before we could adjust our plans, the family pressure began in earnest. That weekend, Delilah showed up at my house unannounced, looking exhausted and confused. Behind her stood our Aunt Margaret from Phoenix, Grandma Rosalie's daughter, who'd never shown much interest in our family until now. Lydia, we need to talk, Aunt Margaret announced, pushing past me into my living room like she owned the place. Delilah has been telling me some very concerning things about your attitude toward this wedding. I looked at my sister, who wouldn't meet my eyes. What exactly has she been telling you? That you're being unsupportive, that you're asking strange questions about Brandon's finances, that you're trying to interfere with their relationship. Aunt Margaret settled into my armchair like she was holding court. Delilah is finally happy with a successful man who can provide for her, and you're sabotaging it out of jealousy. Jealousy? The word came out harsher than I intended.
Come on, Lydia. You're 34, unmarried, working a security job while your younger sister is marrying a lawyer? It's natural to feel envious, but you can't let those feelings destroy her happiness. I stared at this woman who'd contributed nothing to our upbringing, who'd tended the card when Grandma Rosalie died but hadn't come to the funeral, who was now lecturing me about family loyalty based on lies Brandon had fed my sister. Delilah, I said quietly, is this really how you feel? My sister finally looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to feel anymore, Lydia. Brandon says you've been acting hostile since the engagement party. He says you asked invasive questions about his law practice when you called his office. He thinks you don't believe he's successful enough for me. Brandon had twisted everything. My investigation into his criminal background had somehow become jealous interference. My attempts to protect her had been reframed as sisterly sabotage. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if he's right. You've never been happy about my relationships. You always find something wrong with every man I date. Maybe this is just another example of you thinking no one is good enough for me.
The manipulation was masterful. Brandon had taken my history of being protective, the same protective instinct that had led me to work 3 jobs to put her through school, to help with her rent, to support her career, and weaponized it against me. Aunt Margaret leaned forward with fake concern. Lydia, honey, I think you need to examine your motivations here. Delilah deserves a chance at happiness, and Brandon clearly adores her. He's planning this beautiful wedding, he's talking about children and a future together. Why are you trying to poison that? Because, I said carefully, I want to make sure she's making the right decision. Marriage is a big step, and I care about her financial security. Her financial security? Aunt Margaret laughed. Lydia, Brandon is a successful attorney. He can provide for her in ways that a courthouse security guard never could. Maybe it's time to accept that your little sister doesn't need your protection anymore. The irony was suffocating. They were lecturing me about financial security while defending a man who is systematically destroying Delilah's credit and planning to commit mortgage fraud in her name. They were talking about protection while I was literally the only person actually protecting her. But the worst part was watching Delilah nod along with every word. I just want you to be happy for me, Delilah said softly. Brandon makes me feel important, successful, like I matter. When I'm with him, I feel like I'm finally building the life we always dreamed about. Why can't you support that? Because the life you think you're building is constructed entirely of lies, I wanted to scream. Because the man who makes you feel important is using your identity to commit federal crimes. Because in 8 weeks, he's going to be arrested at your wedding, and you're going to discover that everything you believed about him was fiction. Instead, I said, I do want you to be happy, Delilah. I've always wanted that. Then prove it, Aunt Margaret demanded. Stop asking questions about Brandon's business, stop making Delilah doubt her choice, and for God's sakes, try to be gracious at the wedding instead of sulking because your sister is marrying up. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling more isolated than I'd felt since we were orphaned teenagers. The federal investigation was proceeding perfectly. Brandon would face justice, and Delilah would be protected from financial ruin. But the personal cost was becoming clear. My sister had chosen to believe Brandon's version of reality over mine. She'd chosen to see my protection as interference, my investigation as jealousy, my concern as sabotage. The family loyalty I'd spent 18 years building had been shattered by a man who'd known her for 8 months. But Agent Kane had warned me this might happen. Judge Ravenwood, financial predators are experts at isolating their victims from support systems. Brandon is turning your sister against you because he recognizes you as a threat. The closer we get to justice, the harder he'll work to undermine your relationship. In 8 weeks, Delilah would learn the truth about Brandon. The question was whether she'd ever forgive me for knowing it first. The next 6 weeks moved with the inexorable precision of federal law enforcement. While my family relationships crumbled under Brandon's manipulation, the investigation expanded into something that impressed even Agent Kane's experienced team.
Judge Ravenwood, what we've uncovered goes far beyond what we initially suspected. Brandon's operation involves a network of accomplices across 3 states. We're looking at organized financial crime, not just individual fraud. The evidence wall in the FBI's conference room looked like something from a movie. Photographs, financial documents, timeline charts, and relationship diagrams connecting Brandon to a sophisticated criminal enterprise. His paralegal, Jenny Chen, wasn't just processing documents. She was running a document forgery operation that supplied false identification to multiple fraud schemes. The loan broker he'd worked with had connections to money laundering operations in Nevada and Arizona. Even his strip mall office was a front. The space was registered under 4 different business names, all used for different types of financial fraud. Deputy DA Sarah Chen had become a regular presence in these briefings, coordinating the state charges that would run parallel to federal prosecution. Lydia, we've identified 12 victims across the 3-state area, with total damages exceeding $800,000. Your sister's case is actually the one that gave us the breakthrough we needed to connect all the other crimes. The scope was staggering. But what impressed me most was the methodical way the team was building an unassailable case. Every financial transaction had been traced, every forged document analyzed, every victim interviewed. Brandon's criminal enterprise was being dissected with surgical precision. But the investigation's progress came with personal costs that grew heavier each week. Delilah stopped returning my phone calls entirely. When I tried to visit her apartment, she wouldn't answer the door, though I could see her car in the parking lot. Brandon had successfully convinced her that I was the problem, that my jealousy was threatening their happiness, that the best way to protect their relationship was to cut me out of their lives until after the wedding. The isolation was devastating, but it also revealed the sophistication of Brandon's psychological manipulation. Agent Kane explained that this was textbook predator behavior. Isolate the victim from anyone who might expose the truth, then position yourself as the only source of support and validation. He's not just stealing her money, Judge Ravenwood, he's stealing her judgment. By the time victims realize what's happening, they're so emotionally invested in the relationship and so isolated from their support systems that they often defend their abuser when presented with clear evidence of crimes.
3 weeks before the wedding, the investigation took a dramatic turn. The FBI's financial analysis revealed that Brandon had been planning something much more ambitious than just marrying Delilah and stealing her identity. He'd been preparing to disappear entirely. Look at this. Agent Kane spread out travel documents across the conference table. Airline reservations to the Cayman Islands, departing 3 days after the wedding. Hotel reservations in Georgetown under assumed names. And most concerning, he's been liquidating assets and moving money into offshore accounts. Sarah Chen studied the documents with growing alarm. He was planning to honeymoon in a non-extradition territory and just never come back. Delilah would have been left with hundreds of thousands in fraudulent debt, a mortgage on a house she couldn't afford, and no legal recourse because her husband had vanished to a country that doesn't cooperate with U.S. law enforcement. The revelation was sickening. Brandon hadn't just been planning to rob my sister, he'd been planning to destroy her life so completely that she'd spend decades recovering financially while he lived comfortably in the Caribbean on stolen money. But there was more. The offshore account analysis revealed connections to previous disappearances. Brandon had done this before. At least twice in the past 5 years, he'd targeted women, married them quickly, destroyed their finances, then vanished to international havens. The FBI was now coordinating with Interpol to investigate his activities in multiple countries. Judge Ravenwood, Brandon Castellanos wasn't going to be your sister's victim. He was going to be his retirement plan. The federal team's response was swift and comprehensive. Rather than waiting for the wedding day arrest, they decided to execute search warrants immediately. Brandon's office, his apartment, his storage units, and even his accomplices' locations would be raided simultaneously to prevent any evidence destruction. I watched from the federal building as live feeds showed FBI agents executing search warrants across the city. Brandon's strip mall office yielded computers full of forged documents, boxes of fake identification materials, and financial records documenting crimes spanning 5 years.
His apartment contained suitcases already packed for the Cayman Islands trip, along with multiple fake passports and over $40,000 in cash. But the most damaging evidence came from Jenny Chen's apartment. When agents arrested her, she immediately offered to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed that Brandon had been bragging about the perfect score he was planning, a wealthy judge's sister who was too trusting to ask questions and too isolated to get help. He called your sister his golden goose. He said marrying into a judge's family would give him credibility for bigger fraud schemes, and that your sister's connection to the courthouse would help him identify other potential victims among court employees. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Delilah hadn't been chosen for love or even just for her money. She'd been selected as a strategic asset for expanding his criminal enterprise. Brandon had seen our family connections, our professional positions, our trust in each other, and calculated exactly how to weaponize all of it for maximum profit. Meanwhile, Brandon remained completely unaware that his world was collapsing around him. The search warrants had been executed while he was in court handling a minor traffic case, ironically, one of the few legitimate legal activities he actually performed. When he returned to his office that afternoon, he found it sealed with federal crime scene tape. According to the surveillance team, Brandon's reaction was immediate panic. He spent the next 2 hours driving frantically between his apartment, his bank, and Jenny Chen's office, gradually discovering that his entire operation had been dismantled in a single coordinated strike. By evening, Agent Kane's team was tracking Brandon's desperate attempts to contact his criminal associates, only to discover that they'd all been arrested or were cooperating with federal investigators. His offshore accounts had been frozen through international banking cooperation agreements. His escape route to the Caymans had been blocked by Interpol alerts. Judge Ravenwood, Brandon Castellanos is essentially trapped. His criminal network is destroyed, his assets are frozen, his escape routes are blocked, and he has no idea how he found him. But he also doesn't know that we know about the wedding plan. As far as he's concerned, these raids could be unrelated to his relationship with your sister. The beauty of the timing was that Brandon had no choice but to proceed with the wedding. Canceling would look suspicious and might trigger questions from Delilah that could expose his crimes. But proceeding meant walking directly into the arrest that federal marshals would be waiting to execute. Tomorrow, we'll be filing the final arrest warrants. By Friday, we'll have federal charges filed in Southern District Court. And Saturday morning, when Brandon arrives at Riverside County Superior Court to marry your sister, he'll find federal marshals waiting to charge him with 15 counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. I felt a profound sense of professional satisfaction, mixed with personal sadness. Justice was about to be served with perfect precision, but it would also shatter my sister's world. The man she thought she loved, the future she thought she was building, the financial security she thought she'd found, all of it would be revealed as lies in the most public and humiliating way possible.
But Agent Kane had one final piece of information that changed everything. Judge Ravenwood, there's something else you should know. When we arrested Jenny Chen, she told us that Brandon has been recording conversations with your sister. He's been building a file of personal information about your family, your job, your finances. We found hours of recordings where he's manipulating your sister into revealing details about courthouse security, judicial schedules, even your personal habits. Brandon hadn't just been planning to rob my sister and disappear. He'd been planning to use the information he gathered about our family to target other court employees, possibly even to compromise courthouse security for future criminal schemes. The man who'd mocked my uniform had been planning to use my sister's access to my life as a weapon against the entire judicial system I'd sworn to protect. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of justice about to be served. I stood in my chambers at Riverside County Superior Court at 7 a.m., watching through my window as federal marshals took their positions throughout the courthouse grounds. Agent Kane had coordinated the operation with military precision. Unmarked vehicles stationed at every exit, plainclothes agents positioned among the early morning joggers in Memorial Park across the street, and a full federal arrest team waiting in the courthouse basement. Judge Ravenwood, we're in position. Agent Kane's voice crackled through the secure radio he'd given me. All units are ready. Mr. Castellanos should arrive for photography at 11 a.m., with the ceremony scheduled for 2 p.m. We'll execute the arrest the moment he enters courthouse property.
I had arrived early, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork, but really because I couldn't bear to be anywhere else when Brandon's criminal empire finally collapsed. This courthouse had been my professional home for 2 years, the place where I'd presided over hundreds of cases, where I'd sworn to uphold justice regardless of personal cost. Today, it would serve as the venue for the most personal case of my career. Sarah Chen joined me in chambers at 8:30 carrying a thick file of finalized federal charges. 15 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of identity theft, 8 counts of bank fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and interstate transportation of stolen property. If convicted on all counts, Brandon is looking at 85 years in federal prison. What about the other victims? I asked. Full restitution orders are already prepared. The moment Brandon is convicted, his seized assets will be distributed to compensate everyone he defrauded. Your sister will actually receive more than she lost since she's entitled to damages beyond just the fraudulent charges. At 10:15, my personal phone buzzed with a text from Delilah, the first communication I had received from her in 3 weeks. Lydia, I know we haven't been talking, but I want you to know that you're welcome at the ceremony today. Brandon says he overreacted before and he wants to start fresh with our family. Please come. It would mean everything to me to have my sister there on the most important day of my life. The message broke my heart. Delilah had no idea that in less than 4 hours, the most important day of her life would become the most devastating. She was reaching out with hope and forgiveness at the exact moment when her world was about to shatter. I texted back, "I'll be there. I love you." At 11 a.m. sharp, the courthouse surveillance cameras picked up Brandon's BMW pulling into the visitor parking lot. He emerged wearing an expensive charcoal suit, looking confident and relaxed, completely unaware that federal agents were tracking his every movement. Behind him, a photographer and wedding planner began unloading equipment for what they believed would be an elegant courthouse ceremony. Agent Kane's voice came through the radio. "Target has arrived. All units maintain position. Will execute when he approaches the main entrance." I watched from my chamber window as Brandon strutted across the courthouse plaza, stopping to take photos by the memorial fountain, gesturing expansively as he spoke to his photographer about angles and lighting. The man who'd mocked my uniform was posing for wedding photos at the very courthouse where I dispense justice daily. At 11:23 a.m., Brandon approached the main courthouse entrance with his photographer in tow. He was mid-sentence, saying something about wanting photos that show we belong in places like this, when Agent Kane stepped out from behind a marble pillar. "Brandon Castellanos, you're under arrest by order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The transformation was instantaneous. Brandon's confident expression crumbled into confused terror as federal marshals emerged from their positions throughout the courthouse plaza. His photographer stumbled backward, camera equipment clattering to the ground as agents moved in from multiple directions. "You have the right to silence soon. You have the right to silence." Agent Kane continued as Brandon was handcuffed in full view of the gathering wedding guests who'd arrived early. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is a mistake," Brandon shouted, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "I'm getting married here today. I know judges. I have connections." Agent Kane's response was perfectly calibrated. "Mr. Castellanos, you're being arrested for 15 federal felonies, including wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy for the... Your connections won't help you with federal charges."
The scene unfolded with surreal precision. Brandon was loaded into a federal transport vehicle as wedding guests began arriving to witness not a ceremony, but the spectacular arrest of the groom. Delilah's college friends, Brandon's supposed legal colleagues, Aunt Margaret who'd driven in from Phoenix, all of them watched in stunned silence as the man they'd believed was a successful attorney was taken into federal custody. But the most satisfying moment came when Brandon, desperate and panicking, spotted me watching from the courthouse steps. "Judge Ravenwood!" he shouted from the back of the federal vehicle. "Please, tell them this is a mistake. You know me. Your sister loves me." The irony was exquisite. Brandon was calling for help from the very person he'd humiliated, begging for intervention from the security guard he'd mocked, pleading with someone whose authority he'd never recognized. I approached the transport vehicle, badge clearly visible on my judicial blazer, and spoke clearly enough for all the gathered witnesses to hear. "Mr. Castellanos, I am Judge Lydia Ravenwood of the Riverside County Superior Court. I am also the person who discovered your criminal activities and reported them to federal authorities. The charges against you are not a mistake. They are justice."
The look on his face was everything I'd imagined it would be. Shock, humiliation, and the dawning realization that the woman he'd dismissed as insignificant had orchestrated his downfall. Delilah arrived just as the federal vehicle was driving away. She stood in the courthouse plaza in her white wedding dress, bouquet in hand, staring at the crime scene tape that now marked where her ceremony should have taken place. The devastation on her face was heartbreaking, but Agent Kane had prepared for this moment. "Ms. Ravenwood?" He approached her gently. "I'm Special Agent Kane with the FBI. I need to explain what just happened and why your sister couldn't tell you about it earlier." Sarah Chen joined us, carrying a folder containing evidence of Brandon's crimes specifically related to Delilah. Bank statements showing fraudulent accounts opened in her name, credit applications she'd never signed, recordings of conversations where Brandon discussed using her as a target for financial fraud. "Delilah," I said softly, "Brandon wasn't who you thought he was. He was never a successful attorney. He was a criminal who targeted you, specifically because of our family connections. Everything he told you about his career, his income, his legal reputation, it was all lies designed to gain your trust so he could steal your identity and disappear with your money." The evidence presentation took 2 hours. Delilah sat on the courthouse steps, still in her wedding dress, as federal agents explained how Brandon had been planning to destroy her financially and abandon her in a foreign country. The recordings of his conversations were particularly devastating. Hearing him laugh about her trusting nature, describe her as his golden goose, and plan ways to use her courthouse connections for future crimes. "He was never going to marry you legitimately," Sarah Chen explained. "The wedding ceremony today was just theater. Brandon was planning to leave for the Cayman Islands in 3 days and never return. You would have been left with hundreds of thousands in debt and no legal recourse." When the briefing ended, Delilah looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. But instead of anger or blame, her expression showed something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. "You saved me. You actually saved my life." The wedding guests had dispersed, the federal agents had completed their reports, and the courthouse plaza had returned to its normal Saturday quiet. But the most important conversation was just beginning. "Lydia," Delilah said, "I need to know something. When Brandon was mocking your job at the engagement party, when he was calling you a security guard and making those horrible comments, you knew you were a judge the whole time, didn't you?" "I did." "And you let him humiliate you because you were already investigating him." "I let him reveal who he really was. His arrogance and cruelty towards someone he thought was powerless told me everything I needed to know about his character. It also gave me the motivation to make sure justice was served properly." Delilah stared at the courthouse where she'd planned to marry a criminal, where instead she'd watched her sister orchestrate his arrest. "Brandon was right about one thing," she said finally. "Someone in our family does have real power, but he was completely wrong about who." 6 months after Brandon's arrest, I sat in my chambers reviewing the final sentencing documents that would close one of the most satisfying cases of my judicial career. Federal Judge Patricia Whitmore had sentenced Brandon Castellanos to 73 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His accomplices received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. The entire criminal network that had destroyed dozens of lives across 3 states was now permanently dismantled. But the real transformation hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had happened in the quiet conversations between sisters, rebuilding trust, in the careful work of healing relationships that had been weaponized by a master manipulator, and in the profound understanding of what justice actually means when it's personal. Delilah had moved back to Millbrook Heights, into a small apartment just 6 blocks from her grandmother's old house on Elmwood Avenue. The financial restitution from Brandon's seized assets had left her in better shape than before she'd met him, but the emotional recovery had taken months of therapy and countless conversations where we'd unpacked years of family dynamics that Brandon had exploited.
"I keep thinking about how he knew exactly which buttons to push," Delilah said during one of our weekly lunch meetings at Cafe Meridium. "He understood that I'd always felt like the less successful sister, that I was looking for external validation. that I'd been raised to prioritize family loyalty above everything else. He used our family's values against us. The therapy sessions had revealed patterns neither of us had fully recognized. My protective instincts, which had driven me to work multiple jobs and pursue success to shield our family from vulnerability, had also created a dynamic where Delilah felt like she needed to prove her worth through external achievements. Brandon had recognized this insecurity and fed it precisely. "But here's what I understand now," Delilah continued. "You weren't trying to control my life or judge my choices. You were doing what you've always done, protecting people you love from dangers they can't see yet. The difference is that this time, the danger was someone who looked like everything I thought I wanted." Agent Kane had explained this phenomenon during the victim impact interviews. Financial predators specifically target people who are seeking security, validation, or advancement. They present themselves as the solution to their victims' deepest insecurities, then exploit those same vulnerabilities to maintain control. "Your sister wasn't chosen randomly," he'd told us. Brandon researched her background, her family situation, her career aspirations. He knew she was dating to find financial stability, and he crafted his entire persona to match what she was looking for. The fact that she was connected to a judge was just an additional benefit he planned to exploit later. The most disturbing revelation had come during Brandon's plea negotiations. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a life sentence, he'd attempted to cooperate with federal investigators by revealing other criminal operations. What emerged was a network of financial predators who shared techniques for identifying and manipulating victims, who traded personal information about vulnerable targets, who viewed romantic relationships as cover for systematic financial destruction. "Judge Ravenwood," Agent Kane had briefed me, "your family was targeted by someone who'd spent years perfecting psychological manipulation techniques. The fact that you recognized the danger and acted on it likely saved not just your sister, but future victims who would have been identified through her courthouse connections." The ripple effects of the investigation had extended far beyond our personal situation. The FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force had used information from Brandon's case to identify and arrest members of similar operations across the country. Sarah Chen's prosecution strategies had become a model for handling complex, family-based financial fraud cases. The courthouse security protocols I'd helped develop ensured that judicial families received additional protection against targeting by criminals seeking to exploit court access. But the personal healing had required confronting uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics. Aunt Margaret had returned to Phoenix in shame after learning how thoroughly Brandon had manipulated her into pressuring Delilah against me. The friends who'd supported Brandon's narrative had quietly apologized, recognizing how easily they'd been deceived by his confident presentation and financial displays. "I think the hardest part," Delilah reflected, "was realizing how much of what I thought was love was actually just validation. Brandon made me feel important and successful, but he never actually knew me. He knew my insecurities and my dreams, but only so he could use them to control me." The contrast with healthy relationships had become clear as Delilah began dating again, this time with the wisdom that comes from surviving predatory manipulation. She'd learned to recognize the difference between someone who supported her goals and someone who exploited her ambitions, between genuine interest in her well-being and calculated research for future manipulation. Meanwhile, my own relationship with professional secrecy had evolved significantly. The courthouse security protocols now included background checks for anyone with regular access to judicial staff, including family members' romantic partners. I'd worked with federal security specialists to develop guidelines for judges whose families might be targeted because of their court positions. But more importantly, I'd learned that protecting people sometimes requires transparency rather than secrecy. My attempts to shield Delilah from the complexities of my judicial role had actually made her more vulnerable to someone who saw our family connections as opportunities for exploitation. "I've been thinking about Grandma Rosalie's old advice," I told Delilah during one of our conversations. "She used to say that real strength isn't about what you can endure alone, it's about what you can build together."
I spent so many years trying to be strong enough to protect everyone by myself that I forgot we're actually stronger when we trust each other with the truth. 6 months after the arrest, Delilah had returned to her work as a victim advocate with new insight into the psychology of financial predators. Her experience with Brandon had given her a unique credibility with clients who'd been manipulated by romantic partners, and she'd become one of the most effective advocates in the county for financial crime victims. "Sometimes I think Brandon actually did me a favor," she said, though she was quick to clarify. Not the crimes, obviously, but the experience of surviving his manipulation taught me things about myself and about predatory behavior that make me better at my job. I can recognize the patterns now, both in clients and in my own life. The civil restitution process had concluded with Brandon's assets being distributed among his victims. Delilah received $47,000 in damages beyond the fraudulent charges, money she used to start a nonprofit organization supporting financial crime victims. The organization operated out of a small office in downtown Millbrook Heights, providing free counseling and legal advocacy for people recovering from identity theft and romantic financial fraud.
On the first anniversary of what would have been her wedding day, Delilah organized a conference at Riverside County Superior Court for law enforcement, victim advocates, and survivors of financial crimes. Agent Kane delivered the keynote address about recognizing and prosecuting romantic financial fraud. Sarah Chen led workshops on coordinating federal and state prosecutions. And I participated in a panel discussion about the intersection of personal and professional responsibility when family members become crime victims. The question isn't whether to get involved when you recognize that someone you love is being victimized, I told the audience. The question is how to use your professional knowledge and resources responsibly to protect them while ensuring that justice is served properly. After the conference, Delilah and I walked through Memorial Park across from the courthouse, the same park where federal agents had positioned themselves the morning of Brandon's arrest. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been a judge?" Delilah asked. "If you'd really been working courthouse security like Brandon thought?" I considered the question carefully. I think I still would have investigated him, but it would have taken much longer and been much harder to prove. He might have succeeded in destroying your finances and disappearing before anyone could stop him. Your courthouse connections would have given him access to target other court employees. The ripple effects could have been devastating. So, Brandon was wrong about everything, but he was especially wrong about underestimating people based on their uniforms. He was wrong about thinking that authority comes from what you own rather than what you've earned. He confused wealth with power, arrogance with confidence, manipulation with influence. He never understood that real authority comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to use both responsibly. As we walked past the courthouse where Brandon had been arrested, where I'd presided over hundreds of cases, where justice continued to be served daily regardless of personal cost, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us here. A man who'd moked my uniform and dismissed my worth had unknowingly chosen to commit crimes against the one family that had both the knowledge to recognize his deception and the authority to stop it. His arrogance had led him to target exactly the wrong people, in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony that rivaled even the most dramatic courtroom procedurals. But the real victory wasn't Brandon's imprisonment or the restitution of damages. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when someone we loved was in danger, we'd found the courage to act, the wisdom to seek help, and the strength to endure the personal cost of doing what was right. Sometimes justice looks like dramatic arrests and federal sentences, but mostly it looks like people who refuse to let cruelty and deception triumph over truth and protection.
And sometimes it looks like a woman in a courthouse blazer who's willing to let someone underestimate her long enough to reveal exactly who they really are.